Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 435. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing very well, Connor. Happy to have you back on. We got a lot to talk about today, but want to just do a quick short note at the beginning here because next week, me and you will be at Pork Fest in New Hampshire. So if anybody is listening, of course, come hang out at the Libertarian Institute area. Connor, I believe, is going to be there all week along with Keith Knight and Scott Horton. I'll be there for the second half of the week. Connor, when exactly are you speaking?
Let me double check.
All right, I'm on at Thursday at 2 o'clock at the main stage, and then from Thursday on, I will be hanging out at the Libertarian Institute area.
All right, fantastic. And I believe my speech is at from 4 to 5 p.m. on Tuesday the 20th.
Okay. And so because of that, there's only going to be a Monday and Tuesday show next week. So everybody, we're going to be one show off next week. If me or Connor have our speech recorded or something like that and the audio's good enough, maybe we'll throw that up at the end of the week or over the weekend. But no traditional kind of show as we usually have at the end of next week. So Connor, with that, you ready to get into it?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. All right, first story up today I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Pentagon did not properly track weapons sent to Ukraine, Inspector General. A report from the Department of Defense Inspector General found that the U.S. government employees in Poland failed to follow procedures to account for military equipment being transferred to Ukraine. In 3 of 5 shipments monitored by the office, Pentagon staffers did not properly track the weapons. Department of Defense personnel did not have the required accountability of the thousands of defense items that they received and transferred in Poland, the IG report said. We observed DoD personnel did not fully implement their standard operating procedures to account for defense items and could not confirm the quantities of defense items received against the quantities of items shipped for 3 of the 5 shipments observed. And Connor, I think this is important, even though it's a pretty limited look into what's happening here. We've shipped billions of dollars of weapons, and they're talking about 3 of 5 shipments. And so a lot of these shipments probably, a few $1 million, tens of millions, maybe $100 million worth of equipment. And so there's probably been hundreds, probably hundreds of these flights that have gone from, and I believe this was particularly looking at ones going from the Air Force Base in Dover, Delaware, to Poland. And they said that, they just didn't count and make sure that the right number of weapons were in the right places. So the Pentagon does not have, this is back to the report, the Pentagon does not have reasonable assurances that their database of all defense items transferred to Ukraine via air transport in Poland was accurate or complete. The report added that the DoD may risk providing more or less equipment than authorized by President Joe Biden and may not be able to verify the quantity of all defense items before they are transferred to Ukraine. The IG office went on to explain that some weapons are shipped without clear documentation, noting that one shipment containing thousands of small arms, night vision optics, and devices, and other types of cold weather gear did not include an air manifest. And this is, I think, somewhat important, Connor, to note here that this happened on a shipment of small arms, which are probably the kinds of things that are a lot easier to steal and siphon off than, say, Javelin missiles or something like that are big and bulky. And so this seems to be concerning to me. The report continued that DoD personnel opened crates to identify the types of defense items contained within the crates, but even then the personnel could not verify whether the number of items they identified represented the true number of shipped because they had no idea how many were shipped. So they opened them up, they counted them, but that really doesn't prove anything. All right, since Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Washington has shipped tens of billions of dollars in weapons to Kiev, including advanced platforms. The Pentagon report examined arms shipments to Ukraine directly from American stockpiles, excluding weapons purchased under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. And so this is only looking, I believe, at the Presidential Drawdown Authority weapons. Pentagon employees in Poland were also said to be unable to identify unlabeled weapons being shipped to Ukraine and were provided incomplete training. Pentagon personnel in Poland further stated that they developed their own procedures based on the procedures followed by the unit performing the mission before them, and the staffers added additional accountability measures based on their own judgment. And so, this is just whoever, probably younger servicemen, Connor, that are happen to be deployed to Poland, and they're just coming up with their own ways to track and do accounting and documentation here. Very concerning. The failure to appropriately monitor shipments has led to accounting problems, with the Inspector General finding discrepancies between the number of night vision optic devices reported on paper documents and the number reported via electronic means. And so again, Connor, they looked at an extremely small sample size here, really small, and even with that, they're finding all these problems. The Biden administration and leaders in Congress have insisted that establishing an office to track the billions in weapons sent to Ukraine is unnecessary. However, the Special Investigator General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, who spent years slamming military malfeasance in America's longest war, said without more oversight, millions of weapons will end up on the black market. In lieu of proper safeguards, and aid frequently gets stolen or diverted to local oligarchs or local politicians, or just the average Ukrainian will see the waste. Sopko explained the result would mean a loss of support for the Ukrainian government by the average Ukrainian who's fighting, dying, and bleeding at the front. And that's what we saw in Afghanistan. The donors, the U.S., were identified as supporting the corrupt oligarchs. And so, Connor, we've already seen these weapons leak out, and we've talked about Finland, Nigeria, and other areas of Africa where they say that these weapons have started to turn up. Next up here, let's talk about this U.S. announces $325 million arms package for Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. This latest package includes additional munitions for the advanced surface-to-air missile systems, Stinger anti-aircraft systems, additional ammunition for HIMARS 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 15 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 10 Stryker Armanel personnel carriers, Javelin anti-armor systems, 2 Blanche optically tracked wire-guided tow missiles, AT-4 anti-armor systems, over 22 million rounds of small arms and ammunition and grenades, demolition munitions for obstacle clearing, tactical secure communication support and equipment, spare parts, and other field equipment. And I do believe that by the U.S. official counting, which I'm guessing is off, this does put them over the $40 billion mark in aid committed to Ukraine. So, Connor, we know that during this recent counteroffensive, Ukraine is taking some pretty substantial losses to the aid that's been provided from NATO countries, and Ukraine was hoping to replace its Leopard tanks, and Germany says that can't happen. And so the German defense minister said Monday that Berlin won't be able to replace every German-made Leopard tank that Ukrainian forces lose in their fight against Russia. I did see today, Connor, that Germany and Poland are nearing an agreement, and I guess they're planning to announce it next month in Lithuania during the NATO summit, that one of the things they're going to do is put together I guess it's going to be a base in Poland that's operated by Germany to repair these Leopard tanks. We'll see what that actually looks like once we know the details of it. All right, Connor, let's talk about future support for Ukraine. I wrote this for the Libertarian Institute yesterday, June 14th. Congress is likely to pass another emergency funding bill for Ukraine, but it will probably receive lesser support, according to the New York Times. A growing number of progressive Democrats and freedom-oriented Republicans may oppose future aid as the White House burns through funds previously authorized by lawmakers. Whatever the ultimate size of the request, there would very likely be enough support in both chambers of Congress to pass an emergency spending bill for Ukraine when it reaches the floor, that outlet reported. Those skeptical of passing another multi-billion-dollar aid package to Ukraine include some Democrats, with a small number on the party's left fringe voicing unease about the continued fight in Ukraine. The New York Times added that several have supported past assistance packages. So, Connor, it's not clear how committed they are, Juan Omar and others. We did have Rosa DeLaRue, the Democrat from Connecticut, who I think is somewhere on the Appropriations Committee and has sponsored past bills, said she only wants this if there's also some spending for domestic issues. And maybe that won't happen, although in the past they have successfully paired funding projects for Ukraine with aid going to Americans or whatever kind of domestic welfare the government's got going on.
Is that the primary angle that the Democrats that are opposing it are taking, is or that there just needs to be more social spending, or are there some that are just against the aid to Ukraine
It's really unclear,
itself?
Connor.
Yeah.
This article doesn't really go into it. It just says that there's progressive Democrats who have voted for it before, but who are now questioning it. So I'm guessing they're having conversations with staffers on Capitol Hill that are kind of giving those details, but aren't actually saying, Representative AOC, Ilhan Omar actually willing to step out and come out against this.
Okay.
All right, so Joni Ernst is an interesting person. She said that, we got to trim the budget and this includes funding for Ukraine. She's very much an establishment hawk when it typically comes to foreign policy. So her opposition is new, and that's interesting. Also have a little bit of news on the NDAA that's being worked through Congress. There is $800 million that for this Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative Fund. And, we've recently talked about that on the show, Connor. It looks like there's about $1 billion left in that. And so this will almost double the amount of money in it. Marjorie Taylor Greene says she won't vote for it if there's any funds for Ukraine. And so, it's not likely to be enough to do it, actually, prevent any of this from going through. But it is interesting that there is some increasing support here, or not support, dissent to the Ukraine policy. All right, next up here, Ukraine wants U.S.-made FA-18 fighter jets from Australia, and I guess there's dozens of them that were in Australia, and they were looking at retiring them, and Ukraine now wants them. I'm not sure this is going to happen, Connor. My guess is if Australia was looking to retire them, they probably would need some pretty significant advances to be moved to Ukraine and be effective on the battlefield. I'm also not sure how different American aircraft are. So let's say they do burn through the F-16s. Maybe the pilots who are trained on the F-16s would be able to hop in the F-18s pretty easily. That doesn't seem particularly likely to me, but it is interesting that Kiev seems to be looking around to all these different places around the world, Connor, and finding different places to try to scrounge up some extra aid and some extra weapons, and asking all these countries personally for their weapons. This was very interesting. This from Day to Camp today. Czech president says Russians in the West should be monitored like Japanese were in U.S. during World War II. And of course, this is one of the great shames of our nation, Connor, the internment of the Japanese during World War II. And we have a Western leader recommending this treatment for Russian citizens in the West. It does seem to me, Connor, that in the initial hysteria of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were some bills put through and some actions taken in the U.S. and state legislators that were like banning Russian products. That seems to have slowed a little bit to me, which is good news. But at the same time, something like this could restart one of those movements. And it's not exactly impossible, Connor, that at least in a state or two in the U.S. that a bill like this maybe could get passed, although I would hope that it would get struck down and we're not going to actually put any Russians in internment camps. All right, next up here, report CIA told Ukraine not to bomb Nord Stream pipelines. Dave did a pretty good job writing this up. I just wanted to share with the audience, Connor, that I really don't think that Ukraine did it. I'm very skeptical of this, and this seems like putting forward a false narrative to try to throw the scent off the true, guilty party here, and that is the Joe Biden administration. And so with that, Connor, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about this great article you wrote for antiwar.com this week.
Yeah. So, dovetailing with what you were just talking about the Russophobia, where, we're sort of at least, especially among liberals, there is sort of an adoption of this virulent anti-Russian sentiment that's more prevalent in Eastern Europe, Baltic states, and places like the Czech Republic, like we were just witnessing here. But it's there's also this very strange situation ongoing with Elizabeth Gilbert, who's a best-selling author, New York Times #1 bestseller. She wrote the book Eat, Pray, Love, among a bunch of other very high-selling books. And she had announced last week that she was going to be writing her own or another novel that takes place in 20th century Siberia. And there was this massive public relations campaign led by, as she put it, her Ukrainian readers. But they basically intimidated her into canceling her own book. So I wrote this one up. It's best-selling U.S. author cancels her own book, Russian PR campaign. Gilbert, the best-selling American author, announced last week that she would soon be publishing a novel set in Russia. Now, in light of a Russophobic public relations campaign unleashed against her, the Eat, Pray, Love author has since rescinded those plans. So, as she put it, in a massive outpouring of reactions, Ukrainian readers expressed anger, sorrow, disappointment, and pain over the book's setting. And this led the author to make a self-described course correction, shelving the novel indefinitely. And it was originally slated for a release in February of next year. And the book is called The Snow Forest. It's set in Siberia during the 20th century. It follows, as she put it, a group of individuals who made a decision in the 1930s to remove themselves from society to resist the Soviet government and to try to defend nature against forced industrializations. And these are her words. And for 44 years, the characters, they live undetected. Then they're discovered in 1980 by a Soviet geological team. And then apparently a scholar and a linguist are sent to the family's home to bridge the chasm between modern existence and their ancient snow forest life. So Gilbert reported that over the weekend, though, she was flooded with messages from Ukrainians telling her it's just unacceptable for her to publish her book at all. She said, the fact that I would choose to release a book into the world right now, any book, no matter what the subject of it is, that is set in Russia, that was considered beyond the pale. And this was the consensus amidst the deluge. And absurd accusations were levied against Gilbert. So I cite here a BBC article that showed that some of the commenters were saying that her book is akin to glorifying the brave Germans in the early 40s in some novel, like a hypothetical novel. So even people that are hawkish on Ukraine and very much of the establishment, just regular writers, well, I think on that basis, just is sort of sympathizing with her in her position and seeing the precedent being set. There's a lot of people that have been coming out. They're seeing some backlash from her fellow authors as a result of this. So there was an article written in The Atlantic by a guy named Franklin Foer, who's a staff writer there, and he said, Gilbert's unpublished book garnered a slew of one-star reviews, all from commenters who hadn't seen the text. Even though her book doesn't seem to remotely venerate Russian nationalism, Gilbert committed the sin of setting her narrative in Russia, and for some of her readers, that was a deeply insensitive, borderline treacherous act. So the author concluded shortly after her announcement that, quote, it is not time for this book to be published, adding, I do not want to add any harm to a group of people who have already experienced and who are all continuing to experience grievous and extreme harm. And further, she insisted to her fans that anybody who's already pre-ordered the book will be fully refunded. So since she announced her decision to pull the book from the publication schedule, as I said, she has been criticized by authors and other writers who feel that caving to the pressure is setting a terrible precedent. And even vehement supporters of escalated U.S. involvement in the Ukraine war have admonished Gilbert for participating in her own modern-day book burning. So, Foer, he says, in meekly complying with the angriest voices, she accepts the argument that setting a book in Russia is an act of collusion, even though that's an entirely nonsensical argument. In effect, she's allowing the irrational feelings of her readers to set the terms of acceptable discourse. For a group to block a book, it just needs to clog the comments on Instagram with hurt feelings, the writer at The Atlantic said. And this was after he recommended that the protesters' energy would be better spent lobbying their governments to send F-16 fighter bombers and Patriot missile systems to Ukraine instead. So then author Lee Steins censured Gilbert as well, pointing out that bowing to the angry mob sets a bad precedent for writers with less money, career stability, and clout than she has. Stein also highlighted the senselessness of the move, emphasizing that canceling the publication of this novel will not make one iota of material difference for innocent Ukrainian citizens. And Suzanne Nocel, who's the CEO of a literary advocacy group called PEN America, chimed in as well, saying the publication of a novel set in Russia should not be cast as an act exacerbating oppression. Fiction and culture are essential to supporting mutual understanding and unleashing empathy. She added, we hope Gilbert might reconsider, and we urge others to rally around the on-time publication of her book and the principle that literature and creativity must not become a casualty of this war. And so I just, adding my own 2 cents, I'm saying using blatant intimidation to compel a beloved, enormously successful American author into canceling her own creative expression for fear that it may humanize the other side in this proxy war in some peripheral way is not how you end wars. What we need are peace talks and diplomacy and negotiations and mutual concessions. That's how wars are ended. But instead, we're pledging over $100 billion to this authoritarian, anti-democratic Ukrainian regime that actively persecutes Christians and bans dissenting media, outlawing opposition parties. They're going to complain about, it's like glorifying the Nazis. Well, there's Nazis incorporated into the armed forces of the Kiev regime. That funding those groups does not help end wars. These are the precise policies, and including teasing eventual NATO membership, as we've been talking about. That's what's prolonging the war. And so banning Russian opera singers or Russian athletes and becoming an anti-Russian society of censorship and repression like Zelensky's Ukraine, that doesn't give us any moral high ground over the Russians or Vladimir Putin. So if the new book burners, as I said, truly wanted to stop the senseless killing of Ukrainians, they would have excoriated Secretary of State Antony Blinken for vowing this month that the U.S. remains dead set against peace talks, eyeing a seemingly perpetual continuation of the bloody war, which has already killed at least tens of thousands of Ukrainians. And where were all these people? Where were all these bleeding hearts, this internet mob, when Boris Johnson went to Kiev and intentionally scuttled the Turkish brokered peace talks that were held in Istanbul more than a year ago? Those negotiations nearly resulted in a peace settlement between the two sides. We know from the Fiona Hill article in Foreign Affairs from last August. And did these people mobilize in March when the White House came out explicitly against a ceasefire when China was trying to broker peace talks? This came after when they were first announced that they were going to do that. And this came after multiple reports already out of Bakhmut explaining that untold thousands of poor, untrained Ukrainian conscripts with little ammunition or support were being thrown into the meat grinder and ripped apart by Russian artillery during this months-long battle, where on the front lines they had an average life expectancy of 4 hours. We have General Mark Milley in November saying that Ukraine had already suffered at least 100,000 casualties during the war, and yet we have Lindsey Graham, the neocon spokesman and U.S. senator, dubbing the war the best money we've ever spent. And he's not canceled for his insensitivity by these people. So there's obviously a double standard here. And now I ask about, is there any outrage when Sullivan and Newland are calling for attacks on Crimea? Not only could that lead to nuclear war, but it certainly has provoked Russia's strategic bombing campaign in Ukraine, where they, until they blew up the Kerch Bridge in October, or until they bombed it, there was no, mass scale strikes against energy and communications infrastructure. And so perhaps there should be a campaign against London's provision to Ukraine of tanks armed with the Challenger 2 tanks, which are armed with radioactive depleted uranium munitions, which we know are linked to environmental contamination and birth defects and cancers, for use on their own territory against Russian forces. The Pentagon is pushing the White House to arm Kiev's Abrams tanks with depleted uranium rounds as well. And so, as you and Dave talked about on the previous show, and Washington, to summarize, has provoked this conflict, and they've carried out this proxy war just to weaken Russia, to quote Lloyd Austin, or the Pentagon chief. And so when the White House uses Ukrainians as nothing more than a battering ram, and the Biden administration in this flailing attempt to save the neocons' vision of a unipolar world, no matter how many people die, come what may. That's what should be opposed. This policy of escalating tensions and brinksmanship with both Russia and China at the same time, in order to maintain what has already gone, their vision of this unipolar global hegemony. That's all gone, and all these policies are blowing back and making the problem worse for them. Just like everything seemingly that Victoria Nuland touches. And so, I just close saying that Gilbert should pull her book out of the fire, stand up to the mob, because obviously this is just ridiculous. There should be, they're very concerned, obviously, that people, I don't think they want her to write the book because, as I said, I think that even just as they're saying, setting the book in Russia is crossing a red line. And I think it's because they don't want people to humanize the other side in the war, when obviously that's exactly what's needed, is for some rationality and for some empathy, and for us not to become so nationalist and so hawkish and so committed to this dogma and propaganda, which is always the goal of this government when we're taken into these wars based on lies. But this one could lead to the nuclear incineration of the whole planet. So it's very important that everybody stand up here, for free speech and for peace, because this against both of those things. Okay. Now we're going to move into the Middle East. This is an article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on June 13th. So 22 U.S. troops have been injured in Syria, in northeast Syria, in a helicopter mishap. So this is as Dave writes, Central Command announced in a press release Monday night that 22 U.S. troops were injured in what they're calling a helicopter mishap in northeastern Syria. The command said that the incident happened on Sunday and resulted in the injuries of various degrees. The press release said that 10 of these service members were evacuated to higher care facilities. And CENTCOM shared little detail about the mishap, saying the cause is still under investigation and that no enemy fire was reported. It's not clear where in northeast Syria the incident took place, but a U.S. airdrop operation involving helicopters was reported on the same day in Al-Hasaka province in northeast Syria. According to Syrian state media, the operation was carried out with the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, and one civilian was killed by U.S. Forces. And the pro-opposition UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights also reported the helicopter raid, but claimed a person affiliated with ISIS was killed in the joint U.S.-SDF operation. Neither account has been confirmed yet, and CENTCOM has not mentioned the operation. The U.S. has about 900 troops in eastern Syria and backs the SDF in the region, allowing Washington to control about 1/3 of the country's territory. And the U.S. claims the occupation is about fighting ISIS, but it's part of the economic campaign against Damascus, of course, which involves crippling economic sanctions and then controlling their oil fields and much of their wheat resources in the occupied areas. So just another great example of why the U.S. should not be illegally occupying the country. And I think it's going to become increasingly difficult, especially with the regional shift that's happening and the normalizations with Syria, with other major players in the region, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so the fact that we have, different foreign ministers meeting in Jordan and from Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Iraq, and they're all calling, and Syria, and they're calling for all foreign forces, meaning the Americans and the Turks, to leave Syrian territory and for Damascus to assume control over all that territory and impose law and order, I think is a major signal being sent to Washington that this is just not sustainable at all. And it's, a great opportunity when something like this happens to see, hopefully Representative Matt Gaetz or somebody like that will bring up the War Powers resolution, which was voted on earlier this year, back up and see if it does any better, because there's just no way this is going to work in the long term. And we're not making any friends over there. So, all right. Now, this next piece is from Dave DeCamp on the 14th. Israel's bombing Syria again. Israeli airstrikes hit Syria. One Syrian soldier seriously wounded. So Israeli airstrikes hit targets outside Damascus early Wednesday, wounding at least one Syrian soldier, according to Syria's Sana news agency. And they said at about 1:05 a.m. on Wednesday, the Israeli enemy carried out an aerial act of aggression from the direction of the occupied Syrian Golan, targeting some sites southwest of Damascus, and the army air defenses intercepted the aggression's missiles and shot down some of them, a military source told the agency. So the source said that the soldier was seriously wounded and that the strikes also caused material damage. And as usual, Israel rarely acknowledges these airstrikes in Syria, but they happen about once a week. Although it may get worse here, especially in the near term. Netanyahu has already doubled, and his defense minister was boasting about that. They've doubled the number of airstrikes over the previous regime. But so keeping in with that pattern, they haven't commented on this latest attack last month. Dave's talking about how Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, made that announcement earlier about the doubling of the airstrikes. And, Netanyahu's been in power since December 2022. And obviously, we've talked about how they've been bombing Gaza. They even did some airstrikes in Lebanon earlier this year, some drone strikes in Iran. And, they're carrying out these massive exercises more recently, preparing for a war on all these different fronts. And Israel frames its operations in Syria as strikes against Iran and Hezbollah, but they often kill and injure Syrians. And according to the Cradle, the Wednesday strikes marked the 18th time Israel has bombed Syria this year. So it also marked the 13th time that Israel attacked Syria since the earthquake in February, which killed thousands of Syrians. Okay. All right, now this is some stuff on Iran, which is very interesting. It looks like it's very possible that there could be some kind of an interim deal that could be concluded here in the near future. So this is out of Middle East Eye, and Dave wrote this up on June 8th. So report, U.S.-Iran close on interim nuclear deal for sanctions relief. So according to a report in Middle East Eye, the U.S. and Iran are near a deal that would reduce Iran's uranium enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, although it's not certain that a final agreement will be reached. Sources told Middle East Eye that direct talks between U.S. and Iranian officials have been taking place on U.S. soil, which marks a significant diplomatic development between the two nations, as previous negotiations were indirect and took place in Vienna. So Biden's special envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, has been leading the U.S. delegation. The Iranian delegation has been led by Amir Saeed Iravani, the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. The Middle East Eye report said the U.S. wasn't interested in restoring the original 2015 nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, but an interim agreement is on the table. The deal would involve Iran stopping their uranium enrichment at 60%. So Iran would also have to continue its cooperation with the IAEA, and Iran and the IAEA have recently resolved several outstanding issues that we've been talking about on the last few shows. And Tehran has a history of being very transparent about its nuclear program, despite U.S. and Israeli claims. So in exchange for the Iranian steps, the U.S. is going to allow Iran to export up to 1 million barrels of oil per day. So a partial resumption, that could be very difficult, just in terms of whether or not businesses in the West will be willing to work with Iran for fear of stepping on, going the minefield that's been created with all these different sanctions over the years. And so, but the idea is that they'll be allowed to export up to 1 million barrels of oil per day, and Tehran will be able to access some of its frozen funds. Haaretz first reported the U.S. and Iran were close to a deal and said that Tehran would be able to access about $20 billion of its assets held in South Korea, Iraq, and the International Monetary Fund. And the deal is not finalized, as both sides need the approval of their leadership. President Biden is already coming under pressure from hawks in Congress, like Ted Cruz, for instance, who are against any sort of diplomacy with Iran or sanctions relief for the Islamic Republic. The U.S. sanctions on Iran have done nothing to change the government, but have had a devastating impact on ordinary citizens. We know that in some regions, according to Alina Duhan, the UN rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, that food insecurity is over 50% in some regions. I believe it's around 60% in some of the worst spots in Iran. And okay, so speaking of Israel, now this one I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on the same day. We saw reports coming out about how Netanyahu was reacting to all of this. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu warned Secretary of State Antony Blinken that no deal the U.S. makes with Iran would prevent Israel from attacking the country over its nuclear program. And this is according to Haaretz. American and Iranian officials are reportedly engaging in direct negotiations on U.S. soil. Now, if true, this would be a huge diplomatic breakthrough, as Dave said, after a series of failed indirect talks in Vienna during the first 2 years of this administration. The two sides may be nearing this interim deal. Okay, so I sort of review some of this. And so the idea is that they're going to cease the uranium hexafluoride enrichment at 60%, which was only begun in response to Israel's attack on the Natanz nuclear facility in April, when the indirect talks with the Biden administration began in Vienna back during the Rouhani administration. And so additionally, the Islamic Republic would maintain its relationship with the IAEA. But Tel Aviv is strongly opposed to the JCPOA, as we've been covering for years. You know, the 2015 nuclear deal, which Trump illegally exited, much to Netanyahu's liking. And so, and sources say the White House has refused to rejoin the JCPOA. And during a phone call, Netanyahu appeared to threaten Antony Blinken, saying that no agreement with Iran is binding to Israel, which will do everything it can to defend itself. Notably, Haaretz first covered the tentative deal between Washington and Tehran, reporting some officials in the Israeli defense establishment say the agreement would be the best case scenario, and reaching such understandings is preferable to the continuation of unfettered Iranian progress toward nuclear weapons. And so, notwithstanding those Israeli claims, at the end there, the CIA and the Pentagon say there's no evidence that Iran, a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for more than 50 years, is seeking a nuclear bomb. But it's interesting to see this split at least that there's some officials in the Israeli defense establishment who do favor a deal like this. And we've noticed this before, where there are some elements within their security establishment who do support the JCPOA. But I think it's much more politically expedient, and it's worked for Netanyahu to just oppose it flat out and lie about Iran, constantly saying that they're seeking a nuke and that Israel's ready to attack if they feel threatened. And so America's top diplomat talked with Netanyahu about, and this is typical spineless Blinken, the threat posed by Iran, and underscored the United States' ironclad commitment to Israel's security and our 75-year-old partnership, according to a statement released by State Department spokesman Matthew Miller. That's what Blinken's response was to Netanyahu's threats. So the Haaretz report added that Israeli Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer and the hawkish Likudnik chairman of the Israeli National Security Council, Shaki Hanegbi, recently visited Washington for meetings with senior administration officials. And during those talks, the Iranian issue was discussed, apparently. And so Netanyahu's nuclear-armed regime for months has been threatening war with Iran. We know, of course, Netanyahu is facing his corruption trial and all this political turmoil as a result of his planned judicial overhaul. Concurrently, he's conducted drone strikes in Iran and dropped myriad bombs on Syria, Gaza, and even Lebanon. And so Israel is conducting these major military exercises, the firm hand war drills, which the head of CENTCOM visited and participated in. And there was this recent report in The Intercept that revealed that, according to documents included within the Discord leaks, it's exposed that the CIA is unsure, actually, whether Israel is truly preparing to unilaterally launch a war against Iran. And such a conflict would spread violently across the region and quickly draw in the United States. Unprecedentedly, though, the Biden administration has taken this extremely dangerous position, as Trita Parsi points out all the time, by repeatedly appearing to greenlight any Israeli action against the Islamic Republic that Tel Aviv sees fit, which is actually significantly more hawkish than Donald Trump even, or George W. Bush, or Barack Obama on Iran. And for example, we had last month National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan declaring in a speech, it might have been at WINEP, but he said Iran can never be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon. He vowed President Biden has repeatedly reaffirmed he will take the actions that are necessary to stand by this statement, including by recognizing Israel's freedom of action. Okay, so now this next story is interesting because a couple of months ago, we covered a story from Middle East Eye that said essentially that the Ayatollah's chosen diplomats were working on these back-channel talks with the United States. And basically that they were doing an end run around Ibrahim Raisi's guys, the president of Iran, and that the Ayatollah had sort of taken over the U.S. file in terms of the diplomacy, and that they were doing this stuff more on the down low. And it appears that potentially these indirect talks that are going on in Oman right now, and if these reports turn out to be true about the direct talks between Mali and Iran's UN ambassador, that maybe this is some of the fruition of those back channel talks that the Ayatollah was apparently, having his men really engage in to try and make some progress after the years of failed indirect talks in Vienna in the last couple of years. And so this is from Dave on June 11th. Iran's Khamenei says nothing wrong with reaching a nuclear deal. So this is Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei saying Sunday that there's nothing wrong with Iran reaching an agreement related to its civilian nuclear program so long as the infrastructure remains intact, its infrastructure. Khamenei's comments come after that Middle East Eye report. And Khamenei made, Dave mentions that both the U.S. and Iran have, of course, denied the claims made in the report, but I don't think that's surprising. It doesn't necessarily mean that the report isn't mostly accurate. And Khamenei made the comments while visiting an exhibition of Iranian nuclear capabilities. He said, "You may want to reach agreements in some fields. Nothing is wrong with reaching agreements, but the infrastructure must remain intact." This is what Khamenei said, according to Iran's press TV. So the Iranian leader also denied claims that Tehran is seeking a nuclear weapon, saying Iran's enemies want to target the country's nuclear program to limit its development. He said the excuse of a nuclear weapon is a lie. This is not the issue. Something else is at play. They know that nuclear advancement will be a key for progress in other issues of the country. Now, Iran is currently enriching some uranium at 60%, far less than the 90% needed for weapons-grade uranium, but Tehran began that 60% enrichment. It's all purely for leverage, and it appears to have worked, actually. But, of course, this was in response to the attack on Natanz in April of 21. Now, according to that report, the idea is that Iran would just stop its 60% uranium enrichment in exchange for that sanctions relief. And we have a White House official saying the report is false and misleading, and Iran's envoy to the UN saying that an interim deal is not on the agenda. Other media outlets, including Haaretz, have reported that there is, there is some developments here. And I think there's a story we're going to get to in a moment about Netanyahu, where he appears to confirm what's in these articles. And so I'm not surprised that both sides are denying it, because politically, the worst thing Biden can do is make a deal with Iran as far as the reaction he'll get from the Republicans and, quite frankly, the Democrats, who have been just absolutely horrible on this issue his entire administration. They should have given him all the political cover he needed as soon as he came into office to just go right back into the JCPOA and say, I'm going back to Obama's deal. That's that. And and basically tell the Republicans to go pound Sam, but he didn't do that. He basically expanded Trump's policies and deferred to Israel on not just Iran, but especially Iran in the Middle East. And so now we have this situation, and I think it may reflect the fact that the U.S. that Biden's White House is particularly concerned about the growing influence of China in the region diplomatically and economically. And so I think they're trying to counter that. But also, it's very possible that they're concerned that Netanyahu may actually, given the current circumstances and his precarious situation domestically, maybe there's some doubt, an honest concern that he may actually launch a war against Iran. And so whatever the reason is, I think that it would be better to join the JCPOA, obviously, but this is still some good news. Okay. Now, this next story, Israel creates new military intelligence unit to prepare for war with Iran. So this is from Dave again on June 12th at antiwar.com. Israel's military has created a new intelligence unit to prepare for war with Iran amid simmering tensions between the two nations, Ynet reported on Sunday. So Israel's been conducting a covert war against Iran for some time, but in recent years, the Israeli officials have been speaking more openly about the fact they're preparing for an overt military conflict with the Islamic Republic. The Ynet report said the intelligence branch of the IDF created the new unit to specifically prepare for a fight with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The head of research for the new intelligence unit, known as Branch 54, told Ynet that the preparations for a conflict with Iran are much different than the wars Israel has waged in Lebanon and Gaza. He said this is a significant mindset change that the IDF is required to make. it is not similar to a war against Hezbollah or an operation in Gaza against Hamas or Islamic Jihad, said the officer, who went by the name Lieutenant Colonel T. We were responsible for providing the military with the knowledge infrastructure regarding Iranian military capabilities and strategic systems under their control. We are engaged in researching the elements of control in Iran from the senior level down to the operators at the front lines. Wynette also spoke with an officer who is compiling a list of targets the IDF can strike inside Iran, who went by Lieutenant Colonel Y. Every day we gather more targets, he said, and objectives at a satisfying pace, and we learn how to strike them effectively. We have already doubled the target bank in Iran, regardless of nuclear facilities. It is very different from interwar operations. An overt military confrontation will be an entirely different story. And, well, that's certainly true. And also, it's very much in doubt whether or not Iran has the ability, whether or not Israel has the ability to even launch an attack on Iran with, with its warplanes and going in there and actually attempting to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities or these other targets in the target bank. As we've discussed, they don't have planes that can carry the bunker buster bombs in order to do that. They don't really have the refueling aircraft necessary to pull off an operation like that, which means that they would also have to land in regional countries and refuel in places like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE. And I really do not think that they're going to want to do that. Especially that might be another reason why we're seeing this push for normalization, or just the fact that Iran is being brought back in from the cold, especially after this Chinese brokered deal in March. Because obviously the policy that the Americans and the Israelis have been implementing for the last couple of years, especially eyeing this NATO-style alliance to surround Iran for a future war, using the Abraham Accords as this foundation, these phony peace deals, which are just about arms sales and bribing these countries with American taxpayer money and throwing the Palestinians under the bus. Obviously, that was ultimately going to result in some kind of massive regional war where all these different countries would have gotten involved and would have paid a huge cost for the U.S. and Israeli priorities. So it's better to just ease tensions and do business with everyone, as the Saudis and the Iranians are now doing, or at least that's the way it looks like things are going. Okay, now. So there's these are the indirect talks with the U.S. and Iran and Oman. Dave wrote this one up on the 12th. So the Iranian Foreign Ministry on Monday said that Iranian officials are holding indirect talks with the U.S. and Oman last month, but they dismissed the idea that this interim nuclear deal is on the table. So Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani appeared to confirm a report from Axios that said the talks took place in Oman on May 8th, when President Biden's top Middle East official on the NSC, Brett McGurk, was in Muscat. Now, according to the report, the U.S. and Iranian officials did not meet directly, and Omani officials acted as mediators. The sources told Axios that the main message that the U.S. conveyed to Iran was a threat that there would be severe consequences if Iran enriched uranium at 90%, which is required to develop a nuclear bomb. But there's no indication Tehran will take that step. And it always bears repeating that they pledged in 2021, I think almost exactly 2 years ago, that they would not exceed 60% enrichment. And they haven't. And they've had ample reasons to do so over the last 2 years, with all the drone strikes and assassinations inside Iran, and the fact that the sanctions have been increased. And as we were just talking about, the buildup, the constant attacks on Syria, including killing the IRGC members, and Mark Milley pledging that the U.S. is going to start actively targeting Iranian IRGC members, and that they're going to target them very harshly over time. All these different things, bombing Syria, over several days consecutively, and then saying this is our message to Iran, as they did last year. But they haven't done that. And I think the U.S. knows, or is pretty confident that they won't. So Middle East Eye also recently reported that the U.S. and Iran were holding direct talks in the U.S., but those negotiations haven't been confirmed. And of course, we're talking about the interim deal here. Kanani said that Iran is not interested in an interim nuclear deal, but they are open to restoring the original 2015 agreement, the JCPOA. There's no sign the Biden administration is interested in doing that, however. Biden has said that the deal is dead. And this is from last November at a campaign rally where he said it's dead, but it's a long story. Now, amid reports of this engagement, Dave just reaffirms that the Ayatollah apparently doesn't think there's anything wrong with reaching another agreement as long as their infrastructure stays intact. Okay. Now, and Khamenei also reaffirmed Iran's position that they're not seeking a nuclear bomb. It's haram. Both Ayatollahs have declared it haram and forbidden because of their religion. And as I say, I think that we even see when, at least a couple of times now, we've had the director of the CIA, William Burns, come out and directly contradict the Israeli propaganda and say that, no, in fact, they are not seeking a nuclear bomb. And the Pentagon has reaffirmed that twice last year in the Nuclear Posture Review, as well as the National Defense Strategy. That is just the facts are. The facts are that Iran is not seeking a nuclear bomb, and they don't have any evidence that they plan on doing that either. So, all right. Now, this next story is about Netanyahu appearing to confirm some of these reports we've been seeing in Haaretz and the Middle East Eye and elsewhere. And Dave wrote this one up on the 14th. So Axios reported Tuesday that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told the Israeli Knesset's Foreign Relations Committee that the U.S. and Iran have been holding indirect talks on a mini agreement, as he called it, related to Iran's nuclear program. Netanyahu said the understanding being discussed between the U.S. and Iran would evolve to Iran agreeing not to enrich uranium beyond 60% in exchange for access to frozen Iranian funds. The two sides are also discussing a prisoner swap that would be part of the deal. Now, according to Axios, Netanyahu said that if he believed an agreement was close, he would stress his objection to it and would make clear that Israel won't be bound by the deal. Now, he has done that, with that call to Blinken. The most interesting thing to me, which is being reported in Times of Israel and elsewhere, and as Dave points out, there's this report, it originates on some Israeli, I think it's Channel 13, where apparently some of the participants here in this meeting with the Knesset's Foreign Relations Committee told this news channel that Netanyahu actually said that Israel, quote, could live with the potential agreement, which is, I think, pretty interesting. He said the U.S. was not interested in reviving the original 2015 agreement known as the JCPOA. Iran recently confirmed that it had held these talks in Oman. The Wall Street Journal reported Wednesday that the meetings took place in February, March, and May in Muscat. And the Journal also reported that Biden's special envoy for Iran, Robert Malley, held talks inside the U.S. with Iran's ambassador to the UN starting at the end of 2022. And those talks continued until April. So, so it's interesting that Netanyahu is saying that. I'm curious why. Maybe I really don't know what to make of that since it's not confirmed, but it's definitely something to keep in mind that potentially Netanyahu won't throw a wrench into this deal. It is not a great deal for Iran, but it's certainly better than the current situation. If they really were talking about returning to the JCPOA, we know that Hanegbi and Netanyahu and his men for years now, especially when Trump lost the election, have been threatening that if Biden attempts to return to the JCPOA, that they would just attack Iran and start a war. So, but it's just interesting to keep in mind that they have this, at least he may have a different position about this interim deal. All right. Now, maybe this explains it. This is the last story I wrote for the Institute on the 14th from yesterday. So U.S. pressures Tel Aviv to decrease its ties with China as Beijing expands regional trade. So Washington is attempting to pressure Tel Aviv into pulling back on its ties and trade with China. This is according to a report in Voice of America, the U.S. state-funded outlet. And so after the European Union and the United States, the People's Republic is Israel's largest trading partner. The report discusses some developments regarding a series of joint Israeli-Chinese infrastructure projects in Israel, including this recently augmented Chinese-operated shipping port in the city of Haifa. We have Chinese companies also building parts of the Tel Aviv light rail system. That is until Washington leaned on Israel to instead hand over those contracts to European firms and Israeli firms. And so the Chinese companies were rejected later on, after a few years. But Hebrew University's Yuri Pines told Voice of America, that China now has the best infrastructure in the world. China is able to export its knowledge, its know-how, its engineers, its workers, and Israel has benefited enormously. Though the U.S. has pressed Israel over the relationship, and Tel Aviv is reportedly curtailing some of its economic agreements with China. Biden has escalated America's economic war against Beijing, including by imposing harsh sanctions and attempting to cripple the Chinese semiconductor industry. At the same time, the White House has expanded the Pentagon's vast military buildup in the Asia Pacific, eyeing a future war between the world's two largest economies. So Gedalia Afterman of Reichman University told Voice of America that there is growing pressure from the United States on Israel to limit its engagement with China, specifically on infrastructure and technology. And that pressure, he said, is starting to yield results. Beijing recently pulled off an unprecedented diplomatic feat when it brokered that normalization deal between Riyadh and Tehran. The agreement saw a full restoration of diplomatic ties between the two longtime rivals, as well as plans to expand bilateral cooperation and trade in the future. And business between China and the Arab world is hitting all-time highs, with the total volume of trade reaching a record $430 billion last year. Now, Saudi Arabia accounts for 25% of that massive figure, with a bilateral trade volume of $106 billion. And over the weekend, Riyadh and Beijing signed $10 billion worth of deals spanning electric vehicles, renewable energy, agriculture, real estate, technology, metals, healthcare, and tourism. And additionally, China in 2021 inked that 25-year strategic and economic partnership with Iran that's worth $400 billion. That might have been last year. But according to Al Jazeera, the Saudi kingdom's officials have said more announcements can be expected, with Energy Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman Al Saud saying more energy deals would be forthcoming. He also brushed off Western criticism of growing Saudi ties with China, saying the kingdom would prioritize its business interests. Pines explained to Voice of America that there has been a shift in the thinking of some of these Israeli analysts who see China, a significant partner of Iran, as well as the Palestinians, as largely benefiting the region with its actions. He said it's so rare to have in the Middle East a major country which is really neutral, which it is not engaged in. It's neither pro-Israeli, nor pro-Iranian, nor pro-Saudi, nor pro-Egyptian. It's just a neutral country interested in economic ties with all parts of this very complicated Middle East equation, he said. The academic added that Beijing may be the only country in the world capable of brokering a peace deal between Israel and Iran. China has also voiced interest in playing a positive role in facilitating talks between the Israelis and the occupied Palestinians. In fact, they've appointed a special envoy to meet with officials from both sides. And the U.S. may be catching on that China is making gains in the Middle East as the appetite for war in the region abates. So last week, of course, I just referenced these reports about this potential deal between the U.S. and Iran, and negotiators are, you're just talking about the fact that they are working toward this policy where maybe there's going to be some limited sanctions relief for Iran. And it's not clear that Iran would have to make many concessions here, just basically stopping their enrichment at 60% and maintaining their relationship with the IAEA. So surprisingly, and I just mentioned that Netanyahu made these comments that it's possible that Israel could live with this deal. And so hopefully there is less appetite for war and more appetite for trade, and that's something China can have an increasingly positive influence in seeing through. I think hopefully the U.S. is going to pick up on that. And the best case scenario is that Israel just decides that they're not going to start a war, regardless of the position Netanyahu is in politically. But the U.S. needs to give up on this, the Cold War style blocks and pitting all these different countries against each other, because it seems to, especially in the Middle East, be losing its popularity, and the U.S. is losing influence as a result.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for the update. And everyone, again, remember, come out to Port. If you're at Port Fest next week, be sure to come out, see me and Connor talk. Connor's at the main pavilion on Tuesday. What'd you say, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, something like that?
Something like that. Yeah, I believe so. 4 to 5.
All right. And then I'm on Thursday, 2 to 3, main stage, talking about Russiagate. I think it's going to be a good one. And do what you can to share the show. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.